The darkness pressed in like a living thing, thick and absolute, swallowing all that dared to exist within it. Nothing moved. Not light, not sound, not hope. She huddled against the jagged wall of the cave, her limbs curled tightly beneath her, as if her small body might vanish if she held still enough. The cold seeped into her bones, a silent invader more patient than the monsters outside. Her oversized eyes, luminous and frightened, scanned the void for something, anything, but found only shadow. Time no longer flowed. It hung stale and endless in that airless tomb. She had once been a child in a village full of light. There had been laughter and siblings chasing glowing insects through tall grass, hands reaching for sparkling wings and feet stumbling over stones in play. Then came the claws. Rough, unrelenting. They tore her away from everything: home, warmth, safety. She remembered the feeling of being dragged, her voice raw from screaming, the sensation of grass turning to gravel, then gravel to stone, until the silence consumed everything. Now she was alone in the dark. The beasts outside made sure she never forgot that. They circled the mouth of the cave, breathing heavy and foul, their grotesque shapes too large and twisted to squeeze through the narrow opening, but close enough to see her. Glowing red eyes stared in hungry and knowing. Every time one leaned forward, every time its guttural growl echoed off the stone, she froze, not daring to breathe. The only barrier between life and death was a sliver of luck, the simple geometry of rock. She hadn't eaten in days. Her stomach had long since stopped growling and now throbbed with a deep ache, hollow and biting. The last thing she had tasted was fruit plucked in haste during those final seconds of freedom, sweet and tart, now just a ghost on her tongue. But hunger was nothing compared to grief. She missed her mother's songs, soft and low and full of color. She missed her father's booming stories, tall tales that never needed to be true to be loved. She missed the way her brother pretended to ignore her while always sliding treats her way. Each memory felt like a cut she couldn't stop reopening. Tears no longer fell in fits, they streamed quietly and without drama, slipping down her cheeks to the dust below. She wiped them away, but more came. Why had no one come for her? Why had the world moved on? She didn't know how long she sat in that place between sleeping and waking, where fear blurred into exhaustion and thoughts repeated like broken loops. Her body was slipping, awareness draining away like water down a crack. But then the silence broke. A sound soft at first, then rhythmic. Footsteps. Not the slither or scrape of a beast, not the clawed scratching of something trying to get in. These were deliberate, heavy, measured. Someone or something was coming from deeper within the cave. Her chest clenched, a new kind of fear igniting beneath the old. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the stone until her back hit the wall once more. Nowhere left to go. She pressed herself into the rock as if willing it to consume her. The sound came closer, echoing with every step. The shadows seemed to thicken, pulled toward the intruder like breath before a scream. Her mind raced, imagining horrors worse than the ones outside. And then came the light. Dim, hesitant, but real. A soft glow filtered through the black enough to reveal a figure. Humanoid. Large. Battered armor caught the glow and threw it in scattered shapes across the stone. The face behind it was lined with fatigue and grime, but the eyes did not belong to a monster. She didn't move. She couldn't. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run back into the jaws of the beasts if need be. But the figure did not rush her, did not raise a weapon or make a sound. It simply lowered the light and raised its hands slow and steady, palms exposed not in command but in offering. She watched, frozen. A strange warmth unfolded in her chest. Not comfort, but something deeper: recognition. A presence. For the first time since she had been taken, she felt seen, real. Her limbs shook as she uncurled slightly, inch by inch, revealing her face to the one who had found her. He knelt at a respectful distance, his body language quiet but clear. He would not move unless she did. She examined him in silence, noting the strain in his shoulders, the way his breathing hitched like someone who had run too far for too long. He looked like someone who had seen too much, fought too hard. But behind the exhaustion was something steadier. A fire banked, but not extinguished. He reached into a pack and retrieved a pouch. Inside were strange rectangular objects. Food. The scent of nutrient sterile preserved wafted toward her. Her body lurched at the reminder of hunger. She took one hesitantly. The taste was bland, but it filled the void in her stomach like a miracle. She chewed slowly, watching him the whole time. He didn't eat. He watched her. When she had enough strength to stand, he rose and motioned toward the entrance of the cave. The beast still prowled, but now there was another choice. She took it. The sprint through the clearing was chaos. The creatures noticed immediately, howling in rage as they lunged. The man moved with precision, his weapon lighting the darkness in bursts of cold blue. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He cleared a path with every step, and when a monster came too close, its jaws inches from her head, he placed himself between them and burned it down with a burst of energy. She had never seen anything die so loudly. They ran until her lungs burned, until the trees swallowed them whole. Behind them, the cave faded into silence once more. The forest was no less dangerous, but it was dense, and the monsters were large. The sound of pursuit dulled, and then she saw it, the ship, camouflaged by vines and shadows, sleek like a silver fish hiding in still water. He ushered her aboard, sealed the hatch, and slumped into the pilot's chair. She collapsed into a seat beside him, lungs pulling in air like they had forgotten how. The vessel shuddered as it lifted from the ground, creatures slamming against the hull in one final protest. But it rose higher and higher until the planet's atmosphere gave way to stars. Only then did she exhale. She watched the clouds peel away beneath them, her wide eyes drinking in the colors of the sky. It was beautiful, impossibly so after all that blackness. But even now her thoughts drifted to home, to songs and stories, to the people who might still be waiting. Her heart didn't know whether to feel hope or guilt. He seemed to sense it. Without words, he began entering commands into the ship's console. A map appeared swirling with red zones and blinking warnings. Then he pointed to a cluster of settlements near a glowing blue lake. Her eyes widened in recognition. That was it. That was home. She looked at him, fear returning. How could they return? The creatures, the desolation. What if there was nothing left? He said nothing, but his hands kept moving. He was already preparing. Not because he had to, but because that was what he did. For the first time since she was taken, she believed in the idea of being saved. The journey back to the surface of the planet was marked not by rest, but by silent preparation. Every movement inside the ship was deliberate. The man moved like someone who had done this before, checking equipment, calibrating sensors, calculating approach vectors. The girl watched him with a quiet intensity, absorbing the way his mind worked through obstacles without pause. Outside the viewport, the stars spun in slow arcs, unchanging in their cold beauty, while the world below loomed larger with each passing hour. It was no longer a place of fear in her eyes. It was her home. When they landed, it was not near the village, but in a remote clearing, hidden beneath a canopy of ancient trees. The ship descended slowly, cloaked and quiet, vanishing into the shadows. The air was damp and rich with the scent of moss and decay. The silence here was different, not absolute like the cave, but alive with the whisper of leaves and the rustle of creatures too small to pose a threat. The man moved first, strapping supplies to his back, his armor patched and reinforced. He handed her a small device, its weight unfamiliar in her hands. She clutched it tightly. The moment was real now. They were going back. The terrain greeted them with indifference. Jagged rocks, twisting roots, and deep thickets stretched endlessly in all directions. The journey became a test of endurance, each step weighted by more than just distance. There were no clear paths, only instincts and memory to guide them. She led at times, recalling faint landmarks, an oddly shaped tree, a boulder scarred by lightning. Other times he took the lead, his senses honed to detect dangers invisible to her. They moved with a shared focus, never wasting breath on words. Every sound in the underbrush snapped their attention to the present. Predators moved in silence, but so did they. They encountered their first threat not long after dusk fell. The insect-like creatures were small, swift, and cruelly efficient. They emerged from beneath the ground, their mandibles glistening with venom. But the man was faster. His weapons were not designed to kill with brutality, but with precision. Each movement was measured, each strike fatal. The girl stood back, breath-held eyes wide. He dispatched them quickly, and then waited for the silence to return. When it did, they kept moving. No words, no celebration, just the path ahead. That night, they camped in a shallow alcove carved into the side of a hill. He built a fire careful to keep it low and smokeless. The flickering light created a circle of warmth, a fragile bubble against the darkness beyond. She sat close to it, watching the flames twist and bend, their movement hypnotic. The man sat beside her, sharpening a blade, his focus unwavering. She thought of her family of home, of stories told around fires like this one. In the silence, her memories rose unbidden, her mother's humming while cooking, her father pretending to wrestle shadows, her brother rolling his eyes at every chance to seem older than he was. Those moments had once felt mundane. Now they felt sacred. They ate sparingly. Dried rations, barely food, but enough to sustain them. The man didn't sleep, or if he did, it was only with one eye closed. He kept watch through the night, occasionally scanning the shadows for movement, ears attuned to the smallest shift in sound. She drifted into sleep eventually, her head resting lightly against his arm. It was not comfort in the traditional sense, but it was enough. She knew someone was watching, someone who wouldn't let her be taken again. The second day was harder. The land seemed to resist their return. Cliffs rose without warning. Rivers cut jagged lines through the forest, and hidden dangers lurked in every bend. At one point, they stumbled into a nest of serpentine creatures, curled beneath moss-covered stones. The man reacted instantly, deploying smoke to obscure their escape. The creatures struck blindly, missing by inches. They fled again, hearts racing, lungs burning. No injury, but the warning was clear. The closer they came, the more hostile the ground became. And then at last they reached the ridge. Below them lay the valley where the village had once stood, a place of warmth and voices and daily rituals. But what met their eyes was ruin. Smoke rose from the blackened bones of buildings, the ground scorched in great arcs of ash and debris. The vibrant patches of farmland had turned to cinders. No movement, no sound, but the low moan of wind through broken rafters. She froze, her breath caught. The silence hit harder than the growls of monsters ever had. He stepped forward, placing a hand gently against her back. A silent signal. Stay. She didn't. Her feet carried her downward despite the weight in her chest. Every step into the wreckage was a step into memory. A doorway once painted with flowers, now cracked and charred, a fountain where children splashed, reduced to rubble. The closer she came to the heart of the village, the more the signs of violence spoke. Claw marks etched deep into stone. Scorch patterns that spoke of weapons used without mercy. The place had not simply burned. It had been attacked with intent. Then came a sound, a voice weak, wary, but human. From behind a collapsed wall emerged a figure, frail, aged, but standing. Behind her, others, children, elders, the remnants of what had once been a community. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they took in the pair before them. Recognition spread like a ripple. The girl was known. Her name whispered, then spoken. Tears came sudden and fierce. She ran, arms outstretched, and collided with someone solid. A man, dusty, calloused, familiar. Her father. The way he held her broke whatever numbness had clung to her since the cave. He didn't let go. Others joined. Her mother, thinner than she remembered, but alive. Her brother pretending not to cry. The world felt real again. The man stepped back, letting the reunion unfold. He watched with eyes that held both relief and sorrow. There was still much to understand. The elder woman turned toward him, her voice steadier now. She spoke of the attack, of who had come, a faction known for their brutality. Not monsters, not beasts, but something worse. Organized, strategic, the Zwanar. They had not come for blood. They had come for life itself. The seed vault had been taken, every crop strain, every plant capable of feeding generations. Without it, recovery was impossible. The Zwanar knew this. They had left the villagers alive, not out of mercy, but because starvation would finish the job for them. The man absorbed this in silence. He looked at the girl, now reunited with her family, and knew the decision had already been made. He would help. There was no ceremony in the choice, no declaration. He simply nodded and began planning. Supplies needed to be counted, routes mapped, risks measured. But the girl saw the tension in his shoulders and understood. He was afraid not for himself, but for what might be asked of him next. She stepped forward, resolute. She wanted to go with him. Her father objected, of course. He raised his voice, his body stiff with the memory of almost losing her. But she stood firm. She was no longer the girl who had been dragged away screaming. She was someone who had survived. The man studied her carefully, measured her resolve. And then, with a sigh that carried the weight of too many missions, he agreed on one condition. She would follow his lead, without question. She accepted, heart pounding. What lay ahead would not be easy. The journey to the Zwaner fortress would take them across terrain even more dangerous than what they had just survived. The man did not pretend otherwise. They would face death again. But this time they would do it with purpose. Together. The land between the broken village and the Zwaner stronghold was less a passage and more a gauntlet of silent threats. The path led through jagged ravines and thick swamps, where the soil hissed beneath every step, oozing chemicals that seared skin and corroded metal. The forest that once marked the outer edge of civilization now served as a borderland to dread. Nothing natural grew there anymore, only mutated roots that twisted in anguish and trees that bled dark sap. The air grew heavier with every mile, as though it resented being breathed. The further they moved, the more the world around them seemed to curl inward, closing like the throat of a beast. Their team was small. The man hardened by countless campaigns. The girl driven by a fire that had only grown since her rescue. Her father still bruised by the weight of loss, but unwilling to stand aside. Alongside them were a handful of villagers, too gaunt to look like soldiers, but with eyes that no longer blinked at horror. They carried old weapons, patched gear, and silent memories. Their goal was not vengeance, it was survival. They traveled under the cloak of night, using the man's ship only for short cloaked jumps that minimized detection. Every landing was followed by long, silent treks on foot, through terrain that had forgotten mercy. At times, the group would halt suddenly, stilled not by noise, but by the feeling that something unnatural was near. They passed fields where nothing grew but rows of metallic thorns. They stepped over carcasses too deformed to identify. This was not a place where anything was meant to live. This was a place where things went to rot, and yet they moved forward. Each night they camped in silence, building no fire. The girl curled up against the cold, her body small but resilient. Her father stood watch with her hand tucked in his when she slept. The man did not rest except in small intervals, eyes constantly scanning for movement, listening for the unnatural silence that preceded a trap. When he wasn't watching the forest, he was drawing plans in the dirt, reviewing blueprints etched from memory and guesswork. The fortress, he explained through gesture and glance, would be heavily guarded, patrolled day and night. The Zwaner did not leave loose ends. When they finally saw it, it looked like a wound in the earth. The fortress rose from the scorched ground like a scar of iron and fire. Steel walls wrapped around it like armor bristling with towers that stabbed into the sky. Barriers shimmered along its perimeter, flickering blue with energy. Drones floated lazily overhead, scanning patterns carved into the air. Beyond the gates, they could make out barracks bunkers and hangars carved into the rock like tumors. The stronghold pulsed with the quiet hum of cruelty refined into architecture. There was no beauty here, only function, discipline, and menace. The man led them to a rocky ridge overlooking the eastern side, where shadows fell longest and patrols thinned during the changing shifts. There, the group crouched in silence, watching the movements of the enemy. They did not speak. They barely breathed. Every flicker of light, every step of a guard was memorized. Patterns emerged slowly. Timings, blind spots, inconsistencies. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The man proposed a plan, laying it out with calm certainty. He would infiltrate the compound from a rear ventilation shaft and move through the internal maintenance corridors, narrow spaces that machines rarely used and men never volunteered to clean. Once inside, he would locate the stolen seed vault. Meanwhile, the girl would draw attention to the perimeter, create chaos, spark confusion, pull guards away from key checkpoints. Her size and agility gave her an advantage. She could move where others couldn't. Her father protested in the silence between glances, his jaw tight with dread. But she stood firm, her eyes unwavering. Her part mattered. She was not just someone to be saved. She was someone who could save. When morning arrived, so did the moment. The girl moved first, slipping through the outer rocks like a wisp of smoke. She moved low, Her breath measured her small hands clutching the makeshift explosive device the man had prepared. It was rudimentary, a mixture of scavenged chemicals set to ignite with light and sound. She reached the edge of the compound, counted the passing guards, and waited. When the moment came, she hurled the device with all her might. It struck a cluster of fuel drums stacked near the loading dock and exploded in a violent blaze of flame and pressure. The reaction was immediate. Alarms screamed through the air. Guards flooded the courtyard in confusion, scattering like hornets from a broken nest. The girl disappeared into the chaos, her small form vanishing between walls and vehicles. Inside, the man moved swiftly. The explosion had drawn security's attention outward. He slipped through the maintenance shaft and into the depths of the fortress, his movements surgical and silent. He disabled surveillance nodes as he bypassed biometric locks with scavenged codes and moved closer to the central vault chamber. Within the deepest part of the compound, he found it. The vault was vast, a reinforced chamber surrounded by magnetic fields and optical tripwires. The seeds, thousands of strains cataloged in coded canisters, rested behind a panel of transparent armor. There were no guards inside. The security systems were deemed enough. But he had planned for this. An electromagnetic pulse device neutralized the barrier's grid, and within moments, he retrieved the vault's core. A cube no larger than his chest, but heavier than it should have been, filled with the hope of generations. He turned to leave. But the moment the door slid open, he met resistance. The figure standing there was not another guard. It was taller, encased in black armor that shimmered with synthetic muscle and steel. Its presence crackled with threat, and its movements carried the weight of command. The leader of the Zwanar had arrived. There was no warning, no negotiation, only the activation of a weapon that pulsed with deadly energy. The corridor became a death trap. Outside, the girl was in motion. Her diversion had worked, but too well. Reinforcements were arriving from deeper inside the fortress. Her escape route was closing. She called into the communicator, panic rising. The man responded only once, his voice clear but urgent. He ordered her to leave. She hesitated, but her father, who had remained on the ridge with a small backup team, placed a hand on her shoulder and began pulling her back. She resisted, tears rising to her eyes, but followed. Inside the fortress, the man engaged the Zwanar leader in a desperate standoff. Every shot from his blaster was calculated, aimed not to kill. He knew that was unlikely, but to distract, to disable, to stall. He dove behind bulkheads, used debris as cover, moved like someone who understood every second counted. When the enemy advanced, he activated a second pulse, disrupting the leader's systems just long enough to escape the chamber. He ran, through fire, through alarms, through walls that groaned under the weight of the fortress imploding around him. The vault pressed against his chest like a promise he could not break. The exit loomed ahead, and beyond it, through the smoke, he saw them. The girl, her father, the villagers, waiting, hoping, praying. He leapt onto the ship's ramp just as the compound behind him erupted in a final towering inferno. The engines screamed in protest as they lifted off the ground below, splintering from the force of the shockwave. But the ship held. The sky opened. They were gone. Above the clouds, the silence returned. Not the suffocating kind from the cave. This silence was different. It held peace. The sky above the village was pale when the ship descended. Dawn had barely broken, and a muted hush hung over the ruins like a breath held too long. The survivors gathered in a loose circle at the landing site, unsure whether they were waiting for hope or confirmation of loss. The ground bore the same blackened wounds, the same skeletal remains of buildings and lives, scorched to their foundations. But now something new broke the horizon, silver metal glinting through the treetops, engines hissing as the vessel touched down. The hatch opened and the man stepped out first, battered and stained with soot and sweat. The container cradled in his arms drew every eye. Behind him, the girl appeared, her face streaked with grime, but alight with something fierce, triumph and weariness fused into one. A murmur ran through the crowd, then silence again, deeper now as the truth settled over them. The seed vault had returned. They moved forward as if in a dream. Hands reached out not to touch the box, but to feel the air around it, to confirm its presence by any means. Some wept quietly. Others stood stunned. The elders came forward, their movements slow and ceremonial, and took the container into their care with reverence. They opened it cautiously, almost afraid that its contents would vanish if touched too quickly. Inside, the glass vials glowed faintly, labeled with etched symbols, organized with care. Thousands of years of cultivation. Every variant, every heritage crop, every flavor and cure and essence that had once colored their lives. Not destroyed, not lost. Saved. Around the clearing, voices began to rise. Not loud, not jubilant, but soft, broken, sacred. They began to speak of rebuilding, of replanting, of the soil that still remembered. The man listened without interrupting, his gaze drifting across the crowd to the girl who now stood apart from it all. Her family surrounded her, arms folded around her, as if afraid she would disappear again. And yet she kept turning toward him, seeking something beyond the embrace of those who loved her. She was no longer only theirs. She had become something else. Later, when the work began and the vault was taken to a secured shelter within the hills, she found him alone beneath a canopy of trees, his armor discarded beside him, chest rising and falling in exhausted rhythm. He stared ahead without focus, not asleep, but lost in a stillness earned through fire. She sat beside him without speaking. The silence between them was no longer born of fear but of mutual understanding. The mission was done, but its shadow remained. In the days that followed, the village became a place of motion again. The survivors cleared the wreckage with solemn purpose. Ash was swept into mounds, metal scavenged and sorted. New frames rose from old foundations. Earth was turned over and seeded with the recovered strains. No one wasted a moment. Every hand had something to hold. Every breath carried the weight of the future. The vault was consulted daily. The elders guided each planting with precision, following the rituals and science passed down through generations. It was not just agriculture, it was resurrection. The man stayed, though he had not planned to. His ship remained parked at the edge of the forest, untouched and half covered by vines. He walked among the villagers without armor, without title. Some nodded to him with gratitude too deep for words. Others simply let him pass, their acknowledgement carried in the small gestures, the offer of food, the brief touch on the shoulder, the shared silence beside the fire. He accepted it all. It was the only payment he would allow. The girl became something of a symbol among them. The one who had returned, the one who had fought. Children followed her through the rebuilt paths, listening wide-eyed as she reenacted the moment the fireball lit the sky, the way her feet had barely touched the ground as she ran through chaos. The adults watched with quiet smiles, letting her tell the story the way she needed to. She was not the same child who had vanished. She had survived the dark, and in doing so, had become part of something greater. But even as the village came back to life, something heavier began to take shape in the air. The man felt it first, a tension that curled beneath the surface of celebration. The Zwanar would not let this pass unnoticed. He had destroyed a vital stronghold, taken something they believed theirs by force. They were not an enemy that forgave, and worse, they were not one that forgot. The elders gathered one evening as the sun dipped below the ridgeline. The man joined them, invited not as an outsider, but as a necessary truth. They spoke of the attack, of the pattern it revealed. The Zwanar had targeted not just this village, but others. They were sweeping across the region, burning and harvesting. Seeds, minerals, clean water, anything of value was being taken. The pattern was clear resource extraction through calculated devastation. The villagers could not survive a second strike. The man offered options: evacuation, relocation, defensive fortification. None were ideal. None guaranteed safety. But none doing anything meant extinction. The village might have been saved once, but lightning rarely struck the same place twice. And when it did, it seldom spared what it had touched before. Preparations began again, this time under a different urgency. The man coordinated with the girl's father and several of the elders to teach basic defense. They rigged warning systems, tripwire alarms made from scrap simple motion sensors, noise traps set at perimeter points. The girl trained too. Not with weapons she could not yet handle, but in ways to disappear when needed, to carry messages, to navigate terrain in silence. Her size became a tool, her speed an advantage. She was no longer being protected. She was being prepared. At night, the man sat outside the village limits, scanning frequencies for movement. The stars offered no answers, only distance. He knew how the Zwanar operated. They would not retaliate immediately. They would wait, calculate, punish when it mattered most. He had seen it before, slow grinding vengeance masquerading as strategy. What had once been a simple mission to retrieve a lost child had become a thread tugged from a much larger web, and the web now pulsed with anger. The girl began asking more questions, not out loud, but in the way she watched, in the way her eyes narrowed when the man inspected weapons, in the way she helped her father fortify the entrances with sharpened stakes and salvaged metal. She had been rescued, yes, but she had also grown through the ordeal, and now she refused to be left behind in the next chapter. The man understood, and he also knew what he must do. The village would not survive a siege no matter how well prepared. If they stayed, they would be picked off, worn down. But if they moved not as fugitives, but as something more, a coordinated exodus with supplies, routes, and protection, they might endure. He proposed the plan to the elders' evacuation in phases, leading families through the southern canyons under cover of darkness. There were settlements deeper in the continent where resistance was already brewing communities, not just surviving, but organizing. With the seed vault secure, the village could join them not as victims, but as a people still whole. It was a hard truth to swallow, abandoning soil buried with ancestors, leaving behind homes rebuilt with calloused hands. But survival had its own sacredness. In the end, the decision was made not from fear, but from the will to live beyond this moment. The village would move, and the man would lead them. The village did not sleep the night before departure. The hours were spent in motion, quiet, purposeful, relentless. Belongings were stripped down to necessities. Tools and seeds packed into crates lined with insulation and wrapped for travel. The seed vault remained sealed, watched over by two elders who never left its side. Children were roused from their beds and wrapped in thick cloths. Food was prepared with care, dried into strips and powdered into pastes. Animals that had survived the fire were gathered into simple harnesses, their wide eyes reflecting a nervous understanding of the coming upheaval. No one protested. They knew what was at stake. The man moved among them like a thread holding a fraying cloth. He checked each load, each pack, each route drawn in the sand. He marked maps with contingencies points to stop places to split if cornered, elevations to gain signal. Every decision was tempered by risk, weighed by the knowledge that what they carried was not just life, but legacy. The girl shadowed him, helping where she could, absorbing everything. She had stopped asking questions. Now she simply watched and remembered. When the first light breached the horizon, they began. The line stretched long and thin as it slipped from the valley floor into the forest beyond. Children clung to parents. Older villagers leaned on walking sticks carved from broken beams. The man led from the front, eyes scanning the treetops and ridges. The girl followed close behind him, stepping lightly over roots and jagged stones. Her father brought up the rear, his gaze cast constantly over his shoulder. The elders walked near the vault, flanked by two others with homemade weapons slung across their backs. The forest accepted them, but not kindly. Branches scraped like claws, and the path wound sharply, climbing without warning, descending into ravines veiled in mist. The air grew heavier as they moved, saturated with moisture and the scent of decay. Small creatures watched from above, their eyes gleaming in the dark. Twice the line had to divert, once for a fallen tree too wide to pass, once for a pit of mud that had swallowed part of the trail. The man adjusted each time, marking changes with strips of cloth or etched symbols. The forest could be an ally if it was learned, but it would never offer mercy. By the second night, they reached the first rest point, an overhang nestled into the side of a ridge, hidden from aerial view by the curvature of the mountain. Fires were not lit. Blankets were shared in silence. The man took no rest. He sat with his back to the stone, a weapon across his knees, eyes watching the slope below. The girl slept near him, but not deeply. Her ears twitched at every sound, her hands still curled around a small object he had given her for protection. The next days were harder. The rain came soft at first, then in sweeping gusts that soaked clothes and blurred vision. The trail became slippery, and older travelers needed to be carried or supported by two others. The mud claimed boots and splintered walking sticks. Spirits dimmed. Even the children grew quiet, their energy drained by the unending pace and the weight of their parents' unspoken fears. It was on the fourth night that they saw the first sign. A small blinking light barely visible through the trees, low, methodical, artificial. The man froze, raised a fist, and the entire line dropped as one. He approached cautiously, flanked by two of the younger scouts. When they returned, their expressions were grim. A scout drone. Zwanar make. They had been tracked. The pace changed. From that moment, every movement was sharper, every whisper lower. The line no longer lingered at rest points. Water was drawn only from fast-moving streams, and fires were forbidden entirely. The children were instructed to remain close, and the elders now rode in sleds dragged behind the sturdiest animals. The man sent 2 scouts ahead at each new bend, each pass, each descent. The girl offered to join the forward team. He did not object. She was ready. They moved through the swamps on the 6th day. The land turned flat, the trees thinner, the air thick with mist. The ground beneath their feet sloshed and gave way. The beasts here did not roar. They whispered low, droning calls that echoed without direction. Twice, one of the animals carrying supplies panicked, tipping its load into the water. The villagers retrieved what they could, but the ground consumed the rest without ceremony. The man grew quieter, more withdrawn. He knew what was coming. The girl saw it in his eyes. By the 7th night, they reached the canyon pass, the final stretch before the highlands that would bring them to the Allied settlements. It was narrow, jagged, the walls rising like teeth on either side. Beautiful once, now weathered and dangerous. The man halted the line. He scouted ahead with 2 others. When he returned, his face was carved with tension. Smoke. Recent. The enemy had arrived first. There was no turning back. The villagers gathered in tight clusters while he marked escape points and assigned roles. The girl stood close as he pointed to a series of ridges that could be climbed if necessary. He explained routes, timing fallback positions. The father protested quietly but firmly. He did not want her in the vanguard again, but she looked at him without fear. She was not a child anymore. At dawn, the trap was sprung. The first fire came from above, a burst of light against the gray sky, signaling the arrival of the Zwanar. Their troops descended from both ends of the pass, uniforms dark and gleaming weapons humming with energy. The man's countermeasure was already in motion. Explosive traps hidden along the ridge flared to life, collapsing parts of the path and creating a wall of dust and stone. The villagers began to move, breaking into the side routes as instructed. The girl led the children through the narrowest path, her steps sure, her head low. Behind her, the father fought alongside 2 others pushing back the front line. The man at the center directed the resistance like a conductor, each signal precise, each fallback measured. But the Zwanar did not rely on brute force alone. They deployed drones fast and efficient that zipped through the rocks and trees like hornets. The girl turned a corner and found one hovering in her path. She ducked instinctively, rolled beneath a fallen tree, and pressed the activation key the man had given her. A concussive burst rang out, sending the drone spiraling into the cliff wall. The children behind her stumbled, but she guided them onward, her hands never shaking. Elsewhere, the man found himself cut off. A detachment of enemy troops had broken through the middle ranks. He retreated toward the vault carrier, still guarded by the 2 elders and one of the remaining fighters. The enemy opened fire. One of the elders fell. The other pulled the vault closer, shielding it with his body. The man threw a smoke grenade and darted through the haze, his movements honed by decades of training. He reached the vault, lifted it with one arm, and ran. He ran through fire, through the sound of screams, through the sharp sting of shrapnel tearing his side. He did not stop. He reached the ridge and climbed, blood trailing behind him. From above, he saw the girl and the children waiting at the next outcropping, her face pale but alive. He turned back once, saw the father below, still fighting, and nodded. The canyon collapsed behind them. It was not clean, not perfect. Lives were lost. The pass was sealed, but the cost was written on every face. When they emerged from the forest on the 9th day, the highlands stretched before them like a promise. Towers rose in the distance, settlements untouched, defenders ready. The villagers wept not for what was gone, but for what remained. They had made it. The seed vault was intact. The girl was safe. And the man, though wounded, still walked beside them. They did not cheer. They did not raise banners. But as they crossed into the new land, every footstep felt like a drumbeat. Not of war, but of return. The land beyond the highlands was nothing like what they had left behind. The air was crisper, tinged with minerals drawn from deep soil, and the light fell with a golden gentleness that softened even the stone. Here, the earth had not yet been wounded. Here, the trees still whispered songs, untainted by fire, and the rivers ran clear without the metallic sting of ruin. The settlements that dotted the slopes were smaller than imagined, but steady, rooted with purpose, surrounded by scaffolding gardens and progress solar nets spread like wings across open ground. Survivors had built this. Not just lived, but built. When the villagers arrived, they were not turned away. Those who came to greet them did not wear uniforms, but tools hung from their belts. Their arms were strong not from battle, but from labor. They asked no questions, made no accusations. They welcomed with food, with water, and with hands already moving to help unload. Word had traveled faster than the caravan. The tale of the seed vault reclaimed, the destruction of the Zwanar outpost, the survival of those thought lost. The man did not speak much in those early days. He remained near the ship, repairing systems damaged in the retreat, keeping his distance from the growing crowds. His presence was accepted but not required. He had fulfilled his role. Now the future was theirs to shape. But the girl stayed near him, not out of dependency, but out of something deeper. A tether formed not by obligation, but by understanding. She brought him updates from the village, bits of food wrapped in leaves, tools when he needed them without asking. She didn't speak, and he didn't ask her to. Work began quickly. The vault was transferred to a secure subterranean chamber at the heart of the new settlement. Its contents were cataloged again, each vial examined, cleaned, and stored in temperature-controlled compartments. The elders from the village joined the local council, offering knowledge and genetic records. What was planted next would not just feed mouths, it would anchor generations. The land was divided by seasons. The first wave was barley and root vegetables, followed by greens and berries. Then long cycle crops that required patience. The soil responded eagerly. Within weeks, green tips pierced the surface like promises. The children took to the fields, pressing fingers into the earth, learning to coax life from seed. The girl, though still small, was often at the center of these efforts, teaching what she remembered from before the fire, translating rituals older than memory into practice. She was not a child of war. She was a child of return. The man remained outside the rhythms of village life. He spent his days scouting the perimeter, mapping new trails, observing the flight patterns of Zwanar drones that still patrolled the outer zones. He knew they would come again, not tomorrow, not perhaps even this cycle, but they would. He marked entry points, trained a few willing hands in basic combat, reinforced the satellite uplinks. When asked why he stayed, he never answered. But those who watched him understood. In time, a monument was built, not of stone or metal, but of living things. A ring of saplings planted in a wide circle just outside the main square. Each tree bore the name of someone lost, burned into its bark with care. The girl planted one herself for the elder who had fallen guarding the vault. She did not cry. She pressed her hands into the soil and whispered something only the wind could hear. The seasons changed. The crops flourished. New shelters were built. A school was founded where history was not recited, but remembered through story. The children grew tall beneath open skies, their eyes not filled with fear, but with questions. And the girl, once hidden in a cave, trembling and forgotten, became part of the fabric of this place. Not because she asked for it, but because she had earned it. Her family thrived. Her father taught others how to build tools from wreckage. Her mother led a council that oversaw food distribution. Her brother, ever the reluctant hero, became a messenger, racing between outposts with satchels of coded information slung over his shoulder. The laughter returned. Not the same as before, but deeper, rooted, earned. And then one morning, the ship was gone. No announcement, no farewell. Just a bare patch of earth where it had once rested, the grass singed in a perfect circle. The man had left. No one knew when he had gone or where. No message was found. But a small bundle was discovered in the girl's hands when she awoke that day, a compass old and slightly scratched, and a patch from his uniform folded with care. She did not speak for a long time, but she wore the compass like a talisman tied to her belt, and the patch was sewn into the lining of her satchel close to her heart. The years passed. The settlement expanded outward, connecting with others, forming trade routes and signal relays. The Zwanar continued to hover at the edges of known space, but they no longer moved unchallenged. Resistance was growing. And wherever the fight turned hot, rumors surfaced of a solitary figure, armor, weathered eyes, steady ship, silent, who arrived without fanfare and left without trace. No name, just a presence, a guardian who did not ask for recognition, only results. Back in the highlands, the garden beneath the monument blossomed into a sanctuary. It was not a place of mourning anymore. It was a place of beginnings. Vines climbed the trees. Flowers bred from the oldest seeds bloomed in wild, improbable colors. The children still played in the dust, but they now carried tools instead of sticks. And the girl, now grown, stood watch from the ridgeline, often her eyes scanning the horizon, not for fear of what might come, but with the unshakable belief that someday, far off in the dusk or the dawn, she might see that ship return. And if it did, she would be ready, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who now knew how to save. Thank you for following the whole story. This is not only the journey of a little girl abandoned in the darkness, but also a story about courage, the connection between seemingly strange souls, and the ability to rise from the ruins to rebuild a future. In life, there are times when we feel completely alone, but just one person reaching out, everything can change. Like the little girl in the story, we can all become the keeper of hope, not only for ourselves, but also for those around us. If you feel this story touches your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Each of your followers is a source of motivation for us to continue bringing emotional and meaningful journeys. See you in the next story.